To reconvene the November 2019 meeting of the Board of Trustees. Trustee Campbell, will you please convene the Committee on Finance?
Thank you, Chairman Day. Will the Committee on Finance please come to order? There are 5 requests for public comment. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to address the board. We have Daryl Engine, Chris Brown, Oscar Hernandez, Rich McGee, and Tessie Reese. Mr. Engine, are the speakers here?
Hello, I'm Charles Toombs, CFA President, speaking for Daryl Egan.
Mike.
Hello, I'm Charles Toombs, CFA President, speaking for Daryl Egan, who had to leave for another meeting. I'm going to read his statement. I'm here today to urge you to ensure that the administrations of the 23 CSU campuses spend funds earmarked by the state legislature for the hiring of new tenure-track faculty as required. We have fought to get better budgets for the CSU, but our efforts are in vain if the money is not spent wisely. You owe it to the taxpayers of our state to see to it that these funds are spent as directed. You owe it to the faculty to provide them with fair compensation and working conditions that come with tenure-track status. And you owe it to our students to make sure that they get the quality education that tenured faculty are better supported to deliver. The state legislature specifically earmarked $25 million in last year's and $35 million in this year's CSU budget for the hiring of new tenure-track faculty, while encouraging the conversion of qualified lecturers to tenure-track status. However, many campus administrations did not spend last year's allocation on tenure-track hiring as required. The campus at San Marcos, for example, received $1.52 million, which was enough to hire 11 new tenure-track faculty, yet it only hired 7. But thanks to our faculty's careful oversight and persistence in reminding our administration of its responsibilities, our administration will not only be spending its full allocation of $906 and $500,000 from this year's $35 million to hire 7 new tenure-track faculty, but it will also be converting an additional 4 lecturers to tenure-track status, thereby making up for the shortfall last year. As you know, we have a new campus president, this is at San Marcos, and a new interim provost. And I'd like to think that they have a better sense of educational priorities than their predecessors, who, as I'm sure you know, had other spending priorities, including $100 steaks and $700 at $700 night hotels in Spain. Still, past experience shows that we cannot rely solely on the good sense and ethical qualms of our campus administrators, and that's why I call on you, the CSU Board of Trustees, to make sure that the campus administrations report how they spend this money properly and accurately. And if they don't spend it as required on hiring new tenure-track faculty, that you hold them accountable and impose real consequences on them. We need to keep getting good budgets from the governor and legislature, but we won't if we see our campus administrators squandering that money. Faculty have better things to do, like teaching our students and doing our research, than monitoring our administrators and making them do their jobs. That's your job. Thank you. For Daryl Egan.
I'm Chris Brown. Can I go now?
Yes.
Good morning, Board of Trustees. My name is Gregory Christopher Brown. I'm a faculty member at CSUF and CFA chapter president. The issue is the money from the CSU budget earmarked by the state legislature for new, not just replacement tenure-track faculty hiring. $25 million last year and $35 million this year. CFA demands that you, the CSU Board of Trustees, exercise strict oversight of the 23 campus administrations to ensure that they are spending the money as directed and not for other purposes. Campuses are supposed to report how they spent their allocation to the Board of Trustees and the legislature, and we want to make sure that they do. Moreover, we want to know what the Board of Trustees will do about it if the campuses don't. We know that many CSU campuses did not spend their allocation of the $25 million for the last year entirely for tenure track hiring and fell short of their hiring allocation. This includes CSU San Marcos and San Francisco State. As Titans, we reach higher. CFA expects the Board of Trustees and the campus presidents to do their jobs and reach higher. Make sure you get the spending reports from each campus and hold them accountable if they don't spend the money on tenure track hiring as they're supposed to do. As my colleague Durrell said, there must be consequences for failure to follow the law, since this was stipulated by the legislature. We need to continue to get adequate budgets for the CSU. We're happy that we received good budgets the last 2 years, but we're still trying to make up for lost ground from the previous 10 years. However, if the legislature sees that CSU campuses aren't spending the money efficiently and effectively as required, then it is going to be hard to make the case that they should continue to provide us with good budgets. If the CSU campus administrations just squander the money, there will be budgetary consequences. So, the Board of Trustees must do your job and make sure the money is spent properly. Do the right thing.
Rich McGee, Chair, Bargaining Unit 9. 2 weeks ago, Governor Newsom, excuse my computer just glitched here, Governor Newsom sent a letter to Chancellor White on November 5th, which included the following statements. In 1996, the CSU halted merit salary steps for support staff, and despite workers' attempts to negotiate increases, they have not yet been reinstated. Meanwhile, executive and managerial salaries have climbed, creating a significant hardship for the most loyal support staff, as well as a growing sense of inequality on our campuses. The troubling absence of merit salary steps takes its biggest toll on the most long-serving workers, who fall further behind their more recently hired colleagues each year they serve our students. Moreover, the CSU is the only state agency that does not provide salary steps to staff. The CSU is an economic engine for our state, and thanks in large measure to your leadership, we are witnessing historic increases in the amount of students who graduate. In order to sustain that commitment, we must take proper care of the tens of thousands of support staff who represent the backbone of the CSU's 23 campuses. The directive from Governor Newsom is clearly stated and is non-ambiguous, especially when he writes, the following, let me find it here, again, I hit the wrong button. I apologize, folks. There we go. Music on hold. The upcoming negotiations should result in an agreement with our labor partners that erases the inversion gap, provides salary steps, and fairly and justly compensates these staff for their hard work. I've examined every single word of your 51-page proposal here today, and I can find no mention of planning for the resumption of salary steps for CSU employees. Neither can I find a pre-allocation of sufficient funding amounts to maintain those steps in the future. Was this simply an omission on your presentation, or were you signaling your intention during the upcoming bargaining sessions? Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Tessie from Unit 2, San Diego State, CSUEU, Chair for Unit 2. As you go and you hear the report for finance this morning, I was looking through the book, and I just wanted to repeat this because actually this did kind of warm my heart a little bit. On page 19 of your booklet here, employees. Much like the students we serve every day, the CSU's faculty and staff are exceptionally diverse and talented, making the CSU a special place to both work and learn. Their unparalleled commitment to quality instruction is shaping the future of California. And I turn the page and I see that there's 52,808 of us, faculty, staff, management, throughout the system. That's a large number of dedicated, loyal employees across diverse campuses and diverse departments. I'm also looking at the finance budget that you're asking for, and for your 52,808 people, you're going to ask the state for $133 million for compensation this next year. I hope that you reevaluate that for the fact that you have your labor brothers and sisters out here who you will be bargaining with next year, all of us at the same time. So when you think about that, I don't think $133 million is going to be sufficient to compensate us all, dedicated, loyal groups of folks. So thank you.
Oscar Hernandez, is he here? No? Okay. Thank you all for your comments.
I'm here. I was going to actually speak for the committee on university and faculty personnel.
Okay, so you can wait when during that session. Thank you. All right, thank you all for your comments. It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Does any committee member wish to remove any item from the consent agenda for further discussion? All right. May I have a motion to approve all the items listed on the consent agenda? Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Any opposed or abstentions? Okay. The items listed on the consent agenda are approved. The committee has only 2 items on today's discussion agenda. Item 3 is an action item requesting approval of the 2020-2021 operating budget request. The item will be presented by Steve Relier, Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer, and Ryan Storm, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Budget. Steve, please begin.
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. During our September board meeting, we discussed the draft proposed budget request to the state of California for the 2020-21 fiscal year. Those discussions were key in preparing the proposed 2020-21 operating budget request, which we present here today for the board's approval. The Graduation Initiative 2025 is a critical driver of this operating budget request. If the state provides the requested resources, we will build on our progress with degree completion, add more high-demand course sections required for graduation, hire additional faculty to teach those courses, and continue to implement other high-impact practices. In keeping with the board's direction, our highest priority is to advocate for full funding of the operating budget request from the state. It will allow the university to fulfill its obligations to California and save many of our students money, enhancing progress toward their degrees. With me today is Assistant Vice Chancellor for Budget, Ryan Storm, who will walk us through the operating budget request. Ryan?
Thank you, Steve. The next few slides include the elements of the proposed 2021 operating budget request. This is the Board of Trustees' request to the state of California to incrementally augment our operating budget for the upcoming fiscal year. So this slide provides an overview of the priority areas included in the proposed operating budget request. These priorities are the same as you saw in September, with more precise recurring dollar figures. Detailed information on the proposed 2021 operating budget request is included in your materials and includes a section on designated balances and reserves. Let's briefly walk through each component of the operating budget request. First up is $105 million for Graduation Initiative 2025. As announced at last month's symposium, we are making very good progress with this initiative. A key use of these funds during this 4th year of the initiative will be student engagement and well-being, as well as the hiring of faculty and staff in strategic areas. As we have shared with you since the beginning, The initiative requires 6 straight years of new investments totaling $450 million in recurring funding by the 6th year. We are seeking $75 million in year 4, which is the next fiscal year. But in year 3, the state was unable to fulfill that installment, so we are requesting to make permanent the $30 million of one-time funding. Now, enrollment growth is our next topic. The state's projected 1.1 million degree gap and the goals of Graduation Initiative 2025 require that we enroll more students. In support of student enrollment, the plan represents a 5% increase, or 18,700 full-time equivalent students. This increase would allow for growth in the average unit load for continuing students and support additional admitted students. This would cost $248.6 million. Next are salary and benefit changes, which total $177.4 million. We have 3 subcomponents to describe: the compensation pool, health, and retirement. As you're aware, most collective bargaining agreements are expiring soon. It is difficult here in 2019 to anticipate compensation pool costs and the revenues to support them when collective bargaining outcomes and state funding decisions are expected sometime in 2020. Due to the asynchronous timing of our budget request deadline, collective bargaining and state decisions included in this plan is $139.8 million. This includes funding for all employee groups, including non-represented employees. The other components of this item are health and pension cost increases. The California Public Employees Retirement System sets and dictates our health and retirement benefit costs, which will increase next year by $26 million and $11.6 million respectively. Next are academic facilities and infrastructure needs. We are taking a multi-pronged approach to address these needs. One approach is the $2 billion general obligation bond that is before California voters for the CSU. That vote will not occur until March. It is also our fiduciary responsibility today to seek in this plan the $75 million in new recurring funding for these needs. This request will finance facility needs in the event that the bond is unsuccessful when put before the voters. Now, under current bond market conditions, dedicating $75 million of recurring funds would finance approximately $1.1 billion of necessary facility and infrastructure projects. This funding would help support the 2021 5-year capital plan, an action item for a little later today in the Committee on Campus Planning, Buildings, and Grounds. So seeking the bond and recurring funding are not the only approaches. A third approach is to request one-time funding, which we will discuss in a later slide. And a fourth approach is to utilize specific portions of our investment income for facility and infrastructure needs. Assistant Vice Chancellor Robert Eaton will better describe this in the next agenda item. The bottom line here is that we have a significant inventory of old buildings with billions of dollars of facility and infrastructure needs, and we must expand capacity for current and future generations of students. It will take a collection of approaches to significantly improve those facilities and our infrastructure. So our mandatory costs, last one for this slide, will total $27.3 million. These costs include an allowance for operations and maintenance of newly constructed facilities, as well as new costs associated with the state minimum wage increasing to $13 an hour. This also includes the CSU's portion of a state loan to CalPERS. Specifically, in 2017, state law authorized the state to borrow $6 billion from a state cash account and make one-time supplemental pension payments to CalPERS. The purpose is to reduce unfunded pension liabilities, and it is expected that the CSU and other departments will benefit from lower than projected pension cost increases over the long run. The law requires that the state general fund and other state funds, including us, repay the loan in the short term over several years. So that brings us to the grand total for the slide. Altogether, these investments in CSU total $633.3 million. So here on the next slide is the revenue side of the picture as proposed in our operating budget request. Based on the priorities articulated on the prior slide, the state would need to invest $548.7 million of new recurring funds in the CSU. With that level of investment, we could increase our overall enrollment by 5%. Those additional students would pay tuition, and we estimate that would yield $84.6 million of new revenue, which would balance the budget plan for 2021. Together, these anticipated revenue sources are $633.3 million, and our recurring operating budget would grow to $7.6 billion if this request is fully funded. So also included in the 2021 operating budget request are two one-time funding items. In their first budget plan, the governor's administration identified a significant amount of one-time tax revenues that were eventually budgeted for expenditure across the state. As an example, the state provided us over $330 million in one-time funding this year. The governor's administration has indicated that at this early stage that the state will likely again have more one-time tax revenues. Therefore, we're putting forward a plan that requests one-time funding for specific items. First up is deferred maintenance. We propose an additional one-time state request of $500 million to help address immediate deferred maintenance needs. As I mentioned earlier, this one-time funding request is part of our multi-pronged approach to addressing our academic facilities and infrastructure needs. As we know, there is an incredible need to address our many capital needs. If we are unable to do so, more of our students, faculty, and staff will be learning and working in safe and relevant environments. Second is basic needs partnerships. Some trustees expressed a desire at the September meeting to again request funding for basic needs partnerships, a coordinated approach to developing programs and strategies that support students experiencing food and housing insecurity and overall student health and safety challenges. Last year, we requested and received $15 million in one-time funding for this. The Chancellor's Office surveyed campuses and concluded that over $91 million is currently dedicated across the system to efforts like this. There is an opportunity here to supplement our baseline investments in basic needs, and we recommend again requesting $15 million in one-time state funds. I will now turn the presentation back to Steve to outline our next steps.
Thank you, Ryan. So as for next steps, we'll deliver the budget request to the governor and the Department of Finance soon after the board meeting so that it can be considered for the governor's January budget proposal. Our first and highest priority is a fully funded operating budget request through the state appropriation increase. You can also expect that we'll continue our collaboration with campuses, alumni, students, and CSU champions in the Capitol and in our communities. You can expect to hear more details about our advocacy strategy and related activities at later board meetings. At this stage, it's not known if we'll ultimately be successful with our requested appropriation or if an economic downturn is just around the corner. Consequently, we have to keep all options open for as long as appropriate. As we've done in past years, we'll follow state statute and prepare for the student leadership a written tuition proposal that will align with the rate of inflation, and we will meet with the California State Student Association later to discuss that proposal. But let me be clear that we do not anticipate a need to raise tuition rates next year, but we have to keep our options open for any unforeseen state budget or economic circumstances. And we'll be back in January to provide you an update on the governor's budget proposal. So in conclusion, the proposed 2020-21 operating budget request would provide the vital resources necessary to serve CSU students and the state of California. The critical drivers of this year's request are the graduation initiative, increased capacity for new students, and improved facilities. These items will benefit all students as they work toward their degrees. We have seen the remarkable results of our investments in the graduation initiative, and this is a critical time to make sure we continue our progress for our current and our future students. We recommend approval of the 2020-21 operating budget request, and that concludes the presentation. We're happy to address any questions.
Thank you for that presentation. And now I will take questions and comments from the board. Okay. Romy, would you like first and then Juan?
Good morning. Last year, at this time, I asked for $1 billion for deferred maintenance. Today, I very much would like to ask for $1 billion for salary and benefits. God knows our faculty and staff and administrators do deserve it. Regrettably, it is politically unrealistic. Therefore, today, I will only ask for a small fraction of it, for a modest increase in the augmentation for salary and benefits as currently proposed. And when I'm done with my speech, I will make a motion to amend the proposed budget request. I have given all of you a handout, I think most of you, because I don't have access to these beautiful presentations. All I'm asking, and I don't think it's really that much, is that the compensation pool, which is currently at, and I round up the numbers, set at $140 million, be increased by 50%, by another 70 million, to a total of 209.7 million. Now, that doesn't blow the overall request out of proportion. It is approximately 12-13% more that was currently proposed. And if you consider that our budget this year was $7.2 billion, and if we assume if we do get the 700 million, which we would be requesting if my proposal goes through, then we would have a projected budget of $7.9 billion. And the 70 million that I'm asking for more is less than 1% of this. So this is not an audacious demand or request that I made last year. Faculty and staff contracts will have to be renewed next summer, and they're always multi-year contracts. We need to assure, not only in the coming year, but also that these bargaining agreements that we will enter to will be sustainable in future years as well. We just heard a good presentation from Ryan Storm. He said it's difficult to predict what the salary increases will be. Precisely for that reason, we have to definitely need more rather than less. We don't want to be too low when we request money from the legislators. Paying the faculty more adequately will improve recruitment and retention of good scholars, researchers, and teachers. And tomorrow we will hear from Rahman how important they are to student success. All these funds, they go to faculty, they will result in better advising, better student instructor interaction. They will benefit student success. They will benefit our graduation rates. They will help us to get to our goals of the graduation initiative. They are absolutely in line with what we're trying to do as a CSU. I don't want to talk about salary compression and inversion. That should be addressed in bargaining. But more often than in the past years, I hear, and I'm at San Jose State, I should say that, and at Silicon Valley, that our graduating students get a higher starting salary than our professors who got them to that point. This is just not right, and I'm talking about professors, not even about lecturers or part-timers. So money will be well spent if we ask for more. It will benefit our over 50,000 employees, and that is faculty, that is staff, and that is also our administrators. The staff, these are the people who keep our facilities in order. These are the people who will guide our students to success. Similarly to administrators and faculty, if you invest the money in salary and benefits, ultimately it will benefit the students. And the board is actually on board with this. I'm quoting from the minutes of our September meeting. It says, "It is the intent of the Board of Trustees to compensate all CSU employees in a manner that is fair, reasonable, competitive, and fiscally prudent in respect to system, budget, and state funding." The conditions are right. The economy is strong, the state budget is very solid, and we have a labor-friendly governor and legislators. We need to seize the moment now, because in future years, we do not know whether we will have such a good confluence of ideal conditions. And lastly, I brought this up in September, and I had conversations over the last 2 months between the meetings with people from the finance division, and the fear is always that we be asking too much, and the legislators will laugh us out of the room. That's what I heard last year. It didn't happen. And the fear of asking too much, this is not a good fear. My fear is that we ask for too little. So I actually have, after all those conversations, narrowed down my request from what I originally wanted to ask for. So hereby I make the motion for the committee to consider to amend the suggested budget request in the line item compensation pool from 139.8 million to 209.7 million.
Okay, do I? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, Latifa, second by Trustee Simon. Do we have a discussion? Do we?
Yeah.
All right, we'll have a discussion on the motion. I think we were going to hear from Trustee Carney.
Madam Chair, perhaps just for protocol, we should ask Andy Jones to tell us, now that there's a motion and second on the floor, what it is we can discuss at this point versus the overall original agenda item. Andy?
Sure, happy to try to do so. You have a couple of choices. Technically speaking, this motion to amend the underlying matter would be appropriate when there is a motion on the underlying matter, which there has not yet been. But you get to the same place either way. So if it's in the discretion of the chair, if you wish to entertain the motion to amend this item now, you would limit your discussion to whether or not this item should be amended. You would then vote on whether or not to approve that amendment, and then go back and entertain a motion on the agenda item itself, either as amended or not amended.
That would be my request. That was my intention, that we discuss this line item and afterwards continue with the discussion and vote on the budget proposal as a whole.
Open discussion on Trustee Sebelius' motion, and Trustee Carney, you wanted to say something?
I'd like to ask Trustee Sebelius, do you have in mind a certain kind of ballpark percentage increase, or, how'd you come up with this number?
Trustee Carney, that has to be left up to bargaining. I am, in full disclosure, I'm the faculty trustee, so I should not get involved with this. I came up with the number because I talked to people in finance, and we had a statewide academic senate meeting last week in which Kara presented to us the same numbers here, and I also had concern about increased cost for healthcare and retirement. I also thought we need more there on that end, but she assured me that this has been well calculated. However, I am not certain that the amount that has been calculated for salary and benefits is sufficient, maybe not only next year, but also in future years when we might not get these allocations, these generous allocations based on the state budget. So I try to do what is reasonable. I am not an accountant and I cannot get into bargaining, but I can see that that number is way too low. Also in the September preliminary proposal, all these line items were there, and there was sometimes, with a graduation initiative, 105 million was proposed and 105 it is. In some other cases, it was a range, and sometimes the November request now exceeded the range or fell in the high end of the range. Salaries and benefits in September were estimated at 150 to 200 million, and we ended up with 177. That is the only line item that didn't receive a generous treatment from September to now November. So, and I also didn't want to ask really for an outrageous amount of money. This will be approximately 1% of our overall operating fund if for 2020-21, and I thought that is a reasonable number.
Okay, I would also like to ask for staff comment on this. I would just say I've been on this board for 4 years, and when I came on the board, our operating budget was $5 billion. Okay, so we've gotten a 50% increase, and almost all of that has gone to compensation, which is a good thing because it was really low. It's a very good thing. But, this is a delicate little dance we go through here about how much it's reasonable to ask for and and when we've crossed some line into being insulting. And so I'd like to, have the staff comment on what they think about this proposal.
Thank you both, Trustee Sebelius and Trustee Carney, for your thoughtful comments. I'll start then. If Ryan would like to make a comment, he can as well. I think Trustee Carney, you captured it I think very appropriately that what we're really looking for here is balance when we approach the state. We're trying to look at the entire budget. What is it that makes sense to ask for to keep the progress on the graduation initiative and on access to students who are now being turned away and on facilities and on compensation. And so we try to look at that from a balanced perspective and not get one of them too out of whack. We also have a lot of conversations with people in Sacramento and the governor's office and Department of Finance, legislative leaders about what is reasonable. And what is reasonable, oftentimes indicator is what is the state doing for its own employees. Because if we're out of whack with that, then we're toast, all right? And what we've put here in this budget is in line with what the state of California is doing with its current employees. So while it is absolutely, what I'm talking about here, of course, is a proposed budget to the state. What I'm not talking about is setting salaries because we have the collective bargaining process. And as Ryan had mentioned, we do have this unfortunate asynchronous process where we're budgeting for money, asking for money prior to having these contracts set in place. But what we're trying to do here is come up with an amount. And our best guess, based on an informed guess, based on talking to people in Sacramento, looking at what the state is doing for its own folks, trying to keep things balanced between the grad initiative, enrollment increases, and have an entire amount that will be viewed as credible and thoughtful by the people who are going to consider it. I'm going to see if Ryan wanted to add anything to that, and I think the Chancellor may have wanted to comment as well.
Thank you, Steve. Chair Kimbell, Trustee Carney. I think the other aspect is in, this asynchronous aspect of our lives makes all of this, sort of seem clumsy on the surface. But if we were to hypothetically imagine an outcome of collective bargaining that required this amount of money and ask for it now, when it gets down to actually the sausage making in the budget, they'll say, show us why you need to do that. And we'll say, well, it's still hypothetical. And so it won't get credibility. Whereas other things in here, such as the health rate changes and the retirement rate, those are known numbers. And they end up having much more weight in that budget process. So our collective bargaining activities that will be occurring during the course of this fiscal year, and making a premise that we get to closure, which I hope we do by the end of this fiscal year in the June of 2020, will then have a number in it. Our first, and those are multi-year contracts. And so if the number that we end up settling is one that exceeds what our ability to pay is, that would not be a healthy place to be. So then in the negotiating process, we tend then to say, okay, well, we know we have this amount of money in this next fiscal year, but then we will be asking for more money in the out years in order to get to what we think is fair and just compensation. And so it's really just the temporal asynchronicity that exists in these processes that make us put this sort of a request in front, because we know from experience that to put in a hypothetical ask that's higher than what we can demonstrate as need will not end up carrying the day.
Chair Day.
Just a quick point of procedural order. So what we have on the floor is a motion to amend staff's recommendation. And so the discussion is on that motion, I guess, technically. Whereas we kind of jumped the gun and we didn't get to discussion on the initial stage of discussion on staff's presentation. So I just want to mention that and look to our legal counsel and secretary if that's correct. Perhaps an option might be for the motion to be withdrawn with an understanding that once initial discussion on the presentation is concluded, we can go back to Trustee Sebelius for a motion at that time. Counsel, is that essentially correct?
That's up to the maker of the motion. If he wishes to withdraw it and reinsert it after the underlying matter has been moved, he can. Otherwise, you could resolve the motion on the amendment currently.
Is it okay? So as the seconder of this motion, I got to my seat and I saw the numbers and I had the same question, where these numbers come from. And the reason why I seconded the motion is, we have these conversations in our communities. The staff here have prepared an excellent recommendation, I believe, for this board to consider. And it is important for the conversation, however unorthodox, for every member of this board, for every member listening in, to our very, very hardworking chancellor, our presidents, the students in here. And we all know one thing. While this may seem unreasonable, it's a lot of money you're asking for, and it's kind of written with a couple of colors of pen, just so you know, very neatly, I gotta say. But it is also unreasonable, theoretically, but literally, for someone who just walked off of a stage with 3 stripes on each of their arms, with $300,000 worth of student debt, to apply to 15 universities for a tenure-track professorship, and to get a professorship at about 1/3 of the universities within our system, then to make less than $75,000 a year. In San Francisco, in San Jose, and in Long Beach, and in Los Angeles, we know that incoming professor cannot afford a 1-bedroom apartment. There it is. Right? So regardless on how we vote, and I absolutely love the rigor that was developed, that's presented to us. But I think the conversation we must consider, that we consistently have to have it, especially with members of the legislature, some of their staff members are here, folks from the governor's office, and us together. So if we think about that professor, we also must think about, in every meeting, in every conversation, about the groundskeeper. We have to think about the folk who operate the garage. So I will yield, but I think it's important for us, regardless how tough we're doing, how hard things are, to consider just the lived experience. And I know we all do. So while I would actually encourage you to think about withdrawing the motion for conversation, but for maybe particularly to bring it back up, but I think it's important to recognize how hard these staff work and how they are struggling and making a conscious decision to educate young people in this state to keep the state alive.
So Trustee Simon, are you withdrawing?
I won't withdraw my second. I'm not going to withdraw my second.
Okay. You're not withdrawing your second. All right. So I'm suggesting that we go back. Oh, yes.
No.
I don't know.
No, I'm not willing at this point to withdraw my motion, because I think it's important that we discuss it. And you must have mistaken me, because staff is included in this. This is not only faculty compensation, right? This is administrators' compensation is in the deans, provosts, presidents. Is this a big request? I don't think this is a big request. I think this is, especially in the bigger context of our good economy, of our discussions of executive compensation increases. And by all means, I want to go on the record, our excellent executive officers deserve marketable salaries, but so does staff and faculty. And this is what almost the entire board has told us in September when we talked about executive salaries, right? It came from you that said we have to pay everybody in the CSU fairly. And I could name the trustees who actually mentioned it and who said we have to also look at faculty and staff salaries. I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Where the buildings, the classrooms, they matter. The instruction face-to-face for students. You cannot tell me that this very modest request is too low when, and I'm very happy when our three-pronged approach to deferred maintenance will yield us, if all comes through, 2 billion in the belt measure, 1 billion financed by the 75 million ongoing funds to get out a bond for deferred maintenance, 1.1 and half a billion in one-time money. That is $3.6 billion for deferred maintenance. I'm super happy about this. But $70 million more for over 50,000 employees. Now, excuse me, if my handwriting is not nice and if it looks scribbled, I have thought over 2 months about it, not only between September and November. I have discussed it with many of you, not trustees, that would be against the law, but with people in the chancellor's office, with people on my campus, with other faculty members, with the academic senate, by the way, who passed last week a resolution to endorse the trustees' budget request with the extra line item that the compensation pool should be augmented. So I'm not speaking just for myself, obviously not. And I'm speaking as a trustee, not a faculty member. So this is for the greater good of the state of California. We are creating an underclass of academics. It is not okay that people who work for companies who clean the rooms there get paid less than people who clean our campuses. It is not okay that people who guide our students to success with advising, with enrollment, get less money than people in HR in other bigger companies. Now, I would like to ask for a lot more, believe me, but I know this is not realistic. And last year, I heard the same arguments when I wanted more money for deferred maintenance. We will be laughed out of the room. The legislators will get mad at us. Well, between September and November last year, I went around and I talked to my legislators and I've introduced myself. I was new as a trustee. They didn't know me yet. I said, hello, Senator, hello, Assembly person. I need $1 billion. And they looked at me flabbergasted. And when I actually explained them why, they actually listened very reasonably and agreed with me. Now, if I go around to the legislators, and you know what, I'm a trustee. I have to look out for the greater good of the California State University. It is absolute my conviction that this is a greater good. I feel we have to ask for this. If the legislators should decide not to fund our full request, so be it. But I do not want to be responsible for underselling our faculty, staff, and administrators.
Okay, so we're at this point, we will go back to the original discussion we had about the operating budget request, and I had several trustees who wanted
Point of order, I did not withdraw my motion.
How can you do
We should
that?
actually discuss this motion.
The discussion is occurring right now. There's a motion and a second, and then we're having discussion.
Okay, we're discussing.
We're discussing Romy's motion.
Unless someone calls a question, there's still discussion. The
All right, and
discussion-
I've had a lot of hands
questions on
from
the
the
motion.
original discussion, and so let me, okay, Juan, you don't have anything. All right, Hugo Morales, and then Peter Taylor. And then
Well,
Becky.
you know, what would I say? I don't disagree with Dr. Sebelius and or those that speak for this, but I'm not for this motion at this time. And the reason is that I think it goes to our own credibility in Sacramento and what we ask for. And I would hate to see a segment of millions of dollars being what somebody could characterize as a slush fund of sorts without, you know, a rationale for each of the pieces. So, and I'm one of the ones who asked that along with seeing comparables on compensation for senior managers, that we also do the same for staff and for faculty. And I continue on that request. But so I would ask Dr. Sebelius to withdraw his motion, and perhaps when we, if if this motion fails, I would hope that he would move to amend the proposal by the staff and see where we go from there, so that there be a, how would I say, a more, there will be more of discussion, and then eventually we build out about where is this money going, because I think that somebody could say, well, you know, this was money, if it were to be, go forward, well, this money was actually for faculty, or this is more faculty, or no, this is for increase of compensation increase of faculty. Anyway, so for that reason, I would like to speak against this motion.
Trustee Taylor?
So clarify for me, CFO Relier, the $140 million that you put in the compensation pool for increases in fiscal 2021, what percentage increases that to base pay of our staff and faculty?
It's roughly about 3%.
3%?
Yeah.
And you're saying the state has given its staff 3% as well?
Well, in that neighborhood, and the reason I say in that neighborhood is, as you can imagine, kind of like CSU, the state has multiple contracts and also multiple years. And each year, depending on the contract and the year, those percentages go up and down. And plus, then there are, I don't know how you would describe this, features of those contracts that will kick in additional money under certain circumstances, say for minimum wage or for achieving a certain step or whatever the thing is. So it's not a clean 3% that the state is doing, because it in some cases might be 2% one year, maybe 2.5%, or maybe 3%, but also with other things inside that. And it will vary depending on the contract and the classification of state employee.
But you
so
feel
prison guards might be one thing, people in the Department of Finance might be something.
You feel confident
Yeah.
that the 140 that you're recommending is neither above and neither below what the state is paying its staff,
Yes.
and that we are in the ballpark
Yeah,
thereof.
we're in the ballpark. That's
Now,
correct.
the issue of overall compensation, I've said many times when I came to the CSU from the UC, I was shocked at how poorly people were paid across the board, from, the person in the trenches all the way up to our executive team. I want to make sure that for comparable positions, that CSU staff isn't underpaid relative to state staff, right? Because for somebody who does landscaping, for somebody who does building maintenance, right, for which the state has many similar type of positions, our state employees paid dramatically more than our employees. Because if they are, and they're each getting a 3%, all you're doing is exacerbating that gap.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that similar positions in similar geographic locations are in fact similar.
Yeah,
in terms
I
of
see.
pay.
I understand your question. I might have to turn to Vice Chancellor Nazario. What I'm not familiar with is job by job comparison of university positions compared to comparable state of California positions.
Yeah, because if the state standard is everybody gets 3%, I get that.
Right.
And I understand the conservative view, but if their folks are paid more, it's really not fair to our staff.
Right.
On the other hand, if our staff are paid more, we ought to take that deal and go with it.
Yeah.
So that's something I'd like, maybe in the context of this motion or the broader discussion, Vice Chancellor Nazario, that matters to me. I'm deeply sympathetic with Trustee Sebelius's point. Our people are underpaid. And we're also concerned that as fiduciaries, we don't want to put ourselves in a position a year or two from now when a recession comes and we get whacked budgetarily, where suddenly we can't afford to keep the people we have. And so finding that balance is a tough thing. I get it. But I do want to understand, particularly in light of the letter that Governor Newsom has sent us, that we are doing everything we can to pay our people fairly.
Okay. Trustee Eisen, did you want to comment? No.
Not yet.
Oh, wow. All the mics were turned off, not just me. So I understand that I'm only supposed to be addressing Trustee Sebelius's motion, but in order for me to understand it, I still need context from the staff And I assume it's appropriate to ask some questions so I can understand how I would want to vote with respect to the motion. So if I understand, Trustee Sebelius is proposing that our request for compensation jump from 140 million to 210 million roughly, and that our overall request jump from 548 to 618. What was our request last year, and what did we receive? And if we also know the answer on the compensation line, that would be helpful to me as well. Do we have those numbers?
I'll have to defer to my staff who has it handy, and Kara Perkins right behind you can explain it real quick.
I'm behind Trustee Simon. We asked for $456 million last year in our total request. What was the second part of the question?
What did we receive?
332.9 million.
And is it possible to know what we asked for on the compensation line and what we received? Or is that not
We
broken
received the
down?
full compensation request, which
was?
was 130.
No, I have it here.
Okay.
My apologies. 147.8 million.
We asked for 147 and we got 147 last year on the
That's correct.
compensation line. Okay. So one of the things, and I totally agree with what Trustee Taylor was saying, we want to be reasonable and fair, but there's an assumption built into your motion that I'm seeing, maybe you're not intending it, that the numbers we're asking for are not reasonable and fair, or will not result in a reasonable and fair decision out of collective bargaining, which, as you correctly say, you cannot be part of that discussion or influence that discussion. But it is not clear to me that these numbers are going to necessarily result, and it sounds to me like from what Steve Relier is saying and from the numbers we just received, that these are designed to produce a reasonable and fair result if all goes, with the asynchronicity that the Chancellor mentioned. So I'm not sure that it's necessary, certainly not necessary to go as far, maybe go as far as we did last year, but plus some, but to go 50% higher, I'm not sure I really see the logic in that request. I'm not asking you because I think you've said quite a bit that we still are digesting.
Well, Trustee Sebelius, and then
Well, maybe this is a compromise in terms to advance the discussion. And I will make it, but I have to address the reasonableness. These are the golden years of the economy of California. If you think that 3% salary increase is adequate in our golden years, then I do not know what to say. But we are asking this year even for less money for salary and benefits than we did last year when we were fully funded for it, in light of the major bargaining contracts coming up. But I wanted to further the discussion. If I leave my motion on the table, then only the committee members of the Finance Committee can vote. Therefore, I will withdraw my motion right now to continue the discussion on the overall budget, but I would want to take it off in the plenary when we bring it up, so that when we usually we have all of the committee motions in consent, and then I will take this out of consent so every member of the board can engage in the discussion and can vote, and also that will give you all time to think about, and it will give the staff to think about whether there is something that can be done in the line item on salaries and benefits. So that said, I will withdraw my motion right now. In the Board of Trustees meeting, I announce it right now, I will take this item off the consent agenda to open it up for the discussion of all and the vote for all Board of Trustees member. I hope that helps. If there's a better way, let me know. I don't want to be obstructionist and I don't want to be hard-headed, but this is truly very important for over 50,000 people in the CSU.
all right. So seeing no more questions or discussion,
I think so. If that motion is withdrawn, I'll move staff's recommendation.
We need Latifa to withdraw herself.
oh,
Well, the motion's withdrawn.
Yeah, but she needs to withdraw.
Does the second need to withdraw the
trust-
second? All right, motion's withdrawn. I place a motion to approve staff's recommendation.
I second them. And I would like to remind all of the trustees that only members of the committee may vote.
But are we going to discuss the actual staff recommendations?
Yes, I'm sorry, we had a few,
Or
we'll go back because we had questions. Right, we will be, so any questions? Okay. Trustee Adamson?
So in the September discussion of the preliminary budget recommendation, there was a considerable amount of discussion by the Finance Committee and the board about what were the incremental numbers within the Graduation Initiative 2025. There's a lot of things evidently rolled into that overall number. One of the things that this board had discussion upon was the EOP and the funding of EOP. In the presentation that we received, it was clear that the leaders of EOP have been incredibly successful in their outcomes, and the discussion was, would in this next budget period with EOP be funded at greater levels than it's been funded in the past, and would we be able to grow that piece of this portion of the budget? I can't determine that from what I've been given whatsoever. So what are the assumptions with regard to EOP's funding in the future years?
Let me start, and then I'll turn it over to Vice Chancellor Blanchard to add some comments. As you can see from the budget request, we have a pretty robust number for the graduation initiative, both the $75 million plus another $30 million, both are recurring funding. A lot of what has been used by campuses for that money are for important actions that relate to what the EOP program has also done. And I think in many ways, the graduation initiative has borrowed the best high impact practices out of the EOP. And Dr. Blanchard is much more familiar with that than I am. And so our thought was, rather than trying to, say, earmark a line item that specifically looks at EOP, which will likely, the way things occur in Sacramento, will likely mean that that could get funded, but they will take it out of our operating budget request. Rather than do that, why not try to be successful with the operating budget request and focus those graduation initiative dollars on best EOP practices. But with that, I'll turn it over to Vice Chancellor Blanchard.
So there's not a whole lot much more to say based on what Vice Chancellor Relier just presented, but just as a refresher that currently we know that we spend between of about $21 million for programmatic operations for the EOP program and an additional $18 million in grant aid that goes to a pretty sizable number of students. And what we are proposing, as you have just heard Steve Relier indicate, is look at the proven practices that are associated with EOP and to find ways through the existing GI 2025 dollar allocation that we're proposing to scale those proven practices. This is not uncommon because we've got some of our campuses already doing just that, San Bernardino, San Diego, as well as San Jose, and that we're proposing that we'll take that model that they are using, look at it very carefully, and be able to use some of the existing dollars that we would receive if approved by this board as well as by the legislature to ramp up the funding for EOP programs across the board.
Okay. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so there's no target for increasing. It's just going to happen organically. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, it wouldn't be organically. It's the fact that when we would write the communications to the campuses in terms of the expectation for the different pillars and how the campuses are to allocate their dollars, that we would be sure that we would be including EOP elements in there so that there would be clarity on the fact that they have to spend a portion of it toward EOP.
But no target.
No specific dollar amount at this point that we have included within this proposal.
Okay.
Okay, trustees Garcia, Taylor, and Fagan.
So I'm, I guess, curious as to why we are insisting on asking for, and so to preface all my comments, I will be speaking on the basic needs one-time request, but I'm curious as to why we insist on asking for one-time funds from last year and then this year again. Because, well, let me say this. Last month, the Senate Select Committee on Student Success made a stop at my home campus at Capilay Pomona. And before the panel, Senator Glazer was, I guess, gracious enough to meet with students. And I was lucky enough to sit in on that conversation. And among the various things that we discussed, basic needs came up and the issue of funding for more, resources that would address our students' mental health concerns, housing insecurity, food insecurity, and things like that. And what we discussed was that, the University of California had received their ongoing funds for it because they asked for it. And we had not asked for ongoing funds. And he said to me, give us, and when he says us, he means the legislature. He said, give us the ball and let us run with it. So I want to echo something that Trustee Sebelius said in his comments that I really identify with. He says that we fear that we may ask for too little. And I say that I agree, I share that fear, because last year I watched then Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom sit at that chair right there and tell this board to be courageous and ask for what we need. Student needs are ongoing and require the constant attention and services that one-time funds simply cannot provide. I mean, by the nature of just being one-time funds, even if we keep asking for them year after year, the uncertainty that comes with the fact that they're one-time funds prevents us from using them for certain things, right? So, I mean, I know that I heard Chair Day make a motion to approve staff recommendations. I don't know if there was a second. So I would, if you made the motion, I would move to amend it to move basic needs partnerships from a one-time request to ongoing funds. And if you did not make that motion, then I will wait.
Am I too compromised at this point to second this?
So are you making a motion?
Well, from what I heard Andy
To
say,
amend?
I need Chair Day's motion first. And I heard him make the motion. I don't know if anyone.
There was a motion and a second. So
There
the
was a-
motion and the second has been made on the underlying agenda item. So if
Okay,
you
so I
now
wish to
make
amend
the
that
amendment
motion.
You may.
I wish to amend that motion. I move to amend that motion. And instead of having basic needs partnerships as a one-time fund, I would like to move it to be ongoing funds.
All right. So are we going,
As a seconder, I speak to it, right? Is that the practice?
you wanted to speak to
Yes,
this motion?
to the motion. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, precisely. Trustee Garcia has made exactly the point that I had in mind too. Last year, we were debating this very issue, and trustees, again, I could name them, but I remember the quotes very well. Trustees have said, let us ask for one-time money right now. Let us prove to the legislators that we apply it prudently and in the interest of the student. And then in subsequent years, we can ask for this money to be augmented to our ongoing budget. And well, I think we have spent that money prudently. I also had the chance, since the budget was passed, I think it was in May, that I spoke to 2 or 3 representatives, and I was not alone, so I have people in this room who can correct me or who can attest to that, to members of the Department of Finance of the governor. And this came up, $15 million for student basic needs that the UC got on an ongoing basis, and the CSU got as one-time money. And the question was asked, why did the CSU only got this one time? And the answer was because they asked for it in one-time funds. And they said they were puzzled too why we did this. Well, I said that was for strategic reasons. We wanted to be modest. We didn't want to aggravate the legislators. We didn't want to look unhumble and not modest. This is not the time to be humble, not when it comes to student basic needs. Let's put this line item in ongoing funds because student basic needs don't end June 30th.
All right. Trustee Morales?
Yeah, I wanted to ask clarification from, Juan, who made the motion, trustee. So what is your motion, if you could single out the amount of money you're talking about? That you, instead of one time, will be permanent, will be ongoing?
Yeah, so the motion was just so not altering the amount, but instead of having it be a one-time funding request.
What is the amount?
15 million, yeah. So it's
Okay.
listed as 15 million for
Okay.
one-time partnerships. I would like to make it ongoing funds.
Okay, thank you for clarification.
All right, Trustee Taylor, you had a question?
All of you know, as a former CFO, I'm going to make these comments, you're going to start thinking I've gone soft. I'm 100% sympathetic with Trustee Edmondson's comments on EOP. Later on, we're going to hear a great presentation. Tomorrow, we're going to hear a great presentation on the progress on GI 2025. A lot of hard work, a lot of money, but I worry we've picked the low-hanging fruit. And to make progress continually on what I think is the signature achievement of this board and of Chancellor White, it's going to take a lot of, in baseball terminology, bunts and singles, and stolen bases and small ball. There are no more grand slams and home runs that are going to allow us to have huge increases in those numbers. It's going to take a kind of a persistent, consistent playing of the field to ensure that we're investing funds in all possible strategies. And we saw last meeting, EOP works. It's not cheap, but it works, particularly with those students who come in disadvantaged. And I think investing in those strategies is something we need to do. So I want to talk about a more affirmative strategy other than give the money to campuses and hope they do the right thing. Secondly, to Trustee Garcia's comment about basic needs. Look, a year ago, his predecessor, Trustee Hinton, got up here and made the same request. Please put 15 million basic needs into permanent base. I spoke against it. And I said, something, for that to work, we have to make the case to the legislature that we can spend the money responsibly. A year later, I think we're in a position to put this in the base budget. Basic needs, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have them? But we're going to have the basic needs for the type of student we serve for years and years and years to come. I really think now is the time to ask the legislature to recognize the reality on the ground and give us the funding so that we can help our young people succeed. Again, it's one of the bunts and singles that's going to be part of the graduation initiative to get us to our ambitious goals in 2025. I realize there's a lot of money here that we're talking about between salary increases and more spending on EOP and basic needs, but it's all in direct connection to trying to drive up our graduation numbers and provide California more trained graduates in the fields that matter that employers need. So I think it makes sense procedurally, as Trustee Sebelius said, to take up amendments on the core staff recommendation tomorrow in plenary. So the entire board can either say, yeah, I like that one or don't like that one, as opposed to now. But I hope we will consider doing that. So I'm willing to vote for a staff recommendation, but know that tomorrow, as this matter is pulled off consent, I think there's some very robust amendments that we should discuss and consider moving forward with.
Well, thank you all for the various perspectives. I'd like to speak back to, as we consider further the basic needs element here, to first be very clear that there's no university in the country who got out in front of basic needs sooner than the California State University. And we did that with commissioning a study to go from anecdote to actual facts to know about issues around food and issues around housing and security. It's also embedded in one of the pillars of the graduation initiative. And so just as the trustees make a decision as to whether to move this from one-time request to an ongoing request, I just want to be certain that you are fully aware that I think, unlike anybody else in the country, and certainly in California, that today our campuses spend $54,365,000 in ongoing recurring funds for basic needs. So it's not just when we talk about adding 15, that's the only 15 in there. It's currently ongoing at $54 million. And on top of that, on one-time investments, there's an additional $23.7 million that is paid year in and year out by our campuses. And external funding for basic needs adds another $13.8 million. So let's not confuse the ask of 15 million as the only money in play when we recognize that today there's almost $92 million in play on this vitally important element that supports our students' ability to succeed. That's point one. Point two is in the Governor Brown era, all our budget appropriations were biased towards recurring funds with some one-time. Governor Newsom has a different approach where our recurring funds are much less and there's more opportunity on one time. So we don't have staff put this stuff together in a vacuum. We have staff put this together balancing need and the reality in which we live with the idea of being successful in Sacramento. And so this is not arbitrary, but it actually is thoughtfully thought through from a strategic, tactical, and a need-based point of view. So you can decide, and we will follow the board's lead here, but I want you to recognize the reality around this particular element as being important, but being funded perhaps at a level that people were not aware of before. Thank you.
Yeah, so, well, thank you for your insight, Chancellor. I realize that, it's not just the 15 million. I know there's more money there, but I share a similar concern that Trustee Adamson had for EOP, where I simply don't see it in the budget. So, in a sense, there's no, like Trustee Adamson's question, there's no target for how much we will spend on basic needs or how much money we'll divert to address those concerns. Moving a specific line item now into the budget would, not only speak to the importance of, or to how seriously we take this issue, but it would also at least provide a little more structure, right? Rather than us having to dig and add those different sums to get to the 90 million. Well, I'm not gonna say. I will say that I appreciate it. I'm afraid that if I say it, incorrectly, it might be devaluing it, but I'm not. Trust me. And then in terms of the success, in the argument about the success in Sacramento, you could argue that last year we were victims of our own success. We succeeded in getting our one-time funds, but now knowing that we could have made it ongoing funds as the University of California did, I kind of feel a little sense of regret not having pushed a little bit harder last year. And I just go back to my comments about what Senator Glazer said to me and what the Lieutenant Governor said. I think I respect staff's consideration in being strategic, but I think now's the time, as then Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom said, now's the time to be courageous. And I think it would be a disservice to our students if we limit ourselves out of a sense of fear, which is justified in a sense. But I think we're already a year behind, knowing that we could have gotten this last year. And I don't want to see ourselves get behind another year.
Trustees Fagan and Abrego, and then Chair Day has a comment.
So actually, I think the chancellor started to answer my question, which was specifically why it's a one-time. And what I gather is you think it's a better chance of getting it because the Newsom administration is focused more on one time than ongoing. And that was just a strategic decision. And all things given, you'd rather have it ongoing, but this is the way to get it. Is that? So my other question to Steve, on the line for compensation pool. So this is just a guess, obviously. So what happens if in collective bargaining, the total compensation pool needed to meet the agreed to demands is either lower or higher? How do you decide where to take the money from somewhere else or add to it on a different plane? How do you deal with the realities versus the guess?
Thank you for the question, Trustee Fagan. This is a dilemma we have each year with each contract, is that we're always trying to get as close as possible to what we think are the resources that we might need. In some years, what we've done, I mean, there's different strategies, and I won't get into the nuances of the contracts, but in some years there have been allowances that have allowed us to push obligations from one year to another year. And again, I don't want to get into specifics because this is not the appropriate forum to me to talk about elements of negotiating a labor contract, but there are mechanisms to push obligations, back and forth in time. And in fact, as was commented on, I think by Trustee Adamson, when we were talking about last year's compensation ask being a little bit higher, it was for exactly that reason, that there was a contract obligation in 1819, which was rolled into 1920, which made that dollar amount actually a little bit more than what we're asking at this time. So there are those types of things that you can do in a contract. But it is not easy, I mean, because you can't predict exactly where the contract's going to come out. But what you can do is, based on all the discussions in Sacramento and elsewhere, is figure out what it has the highest chance to succeed in terms of an increment to our budget that gives us the flexibility to be successful in bargaining. And that's really what it's all about. One other thing I'll mention, in addition to what the Chancellor said about the current signals we're getting, very strong signals in Sacramento, that shifts us even more in that balance between recurring and one-time funds, more towards one-time funding, is that it's clear that there is more uncertainty about the future, and that will continue to push, that will probably likely to be more successful in getting one-time funds. And I don't want to get into comparing the UC budget to the CSU budget, but when one of the systems gets, say, something funded on a recurring basis, it's not always additive. And in fact, most times it's not additive. Oftentimes, what you're not recognizing is there's another piece of the budget that is decreased or not received. I know that, for example, our success with funding of the graduation initiative is pretty unique to CSU. I'm sure there are other things perhaps we could have gotten funded instead of the graduation initiative that would have had lesser impact on our mission and our priorities. I know that UC has consulted with us on our success about the graduation initiative. And I guess what I'm trying to say is there's kind of, to some extent, a zero-sum game here, where not every request is just viewed all by itself in isolation and then layered on top of whatever else you're going to get. Most of the time, there's going to be a cost somewhere else for getting that thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Is Abrego and Chair Day and McGrory.
I need a point of clarification here. I'm not part of the committee, but I do agree with Peter and Trustee Taylor and Trustee Garcia. My question is related to EOP, and of course, designated funding would would be very helpful to the EOP program. It has two areas, service and financial aid. It was my understanding years ago that EOP is a categorical funded program. So is that still a legislative funded program, or does it just come as part of the general CSU fund?
Many years ago during, I think it was the mid-2000s, one of the recessions or downturns, we had a situation where we had a number of line items in our budget. Okay, UC had the same thing, other state agencies did too. So during the recession of that period, it was determined that EOP and other types of earmarks or items that were specifically called out were rolled in simply because it was understood by the legislature and the governor at the time that that funding needed to be flexed a bit in order to allow for the universities to respond to budget cuts. But in terms of EOP, and as far as that's concerned, there's been an ongoing commitment by the campuses and by the university to continue to recognize the funding that was in the budget during that time frame. So campuses are spending at the same amounts that they were back then. So the requirement was removed, but the CSU still committed to funding EOP at the same levels.
So if we were to track the EOP budget from 8 years ago, the campuses are still directing that money, the same amount of money, into the EOP programs. They haven't been redirected.
That's my understanding. And then also you have to layer onto it the fact that every campus has its own unique flavor in terms of EOP, right? They all run programs slightly different in unique ways. I think that goes to the larger question of asking for a lump sum money for, in this case, because the question on the floor is about basic needs. If you ask for a large item specifically for basic needs, you still have to get to the point of how does that best utilized on each and every campus and what they already have in the base and what they need to use the new money for. The challenge, I think, in running and adding in more money, say for EOP or basic needs, is you have a situation where you don't know the perfect lay of the land on the campus. And when you do lay in their specific augmentations for these particular programs, you may be funding something that is already robustly funded on a particular campus, or you could be adding a lot of money to a campus that could use that money. So that's the challenge here. The other point I wanted to add, since I'm talking and I wanted to point this out, it kind of dovetails in on what the chancellor was speaking and Steve was speaking about. The graduation initiative for many years and has been a primary priority of this university. And it's been one of those things that I routinely call a bread and butter item: compensation, grad initiative, facilities. Those are things that we request day in and day out. They aren't sexy, they aren't super exciting to a lot of people, but those really fund the university going forward. What you as a board have to weigh is when and if you add EOP or if you add basic needs on a recurring side, you have to be willing to accept the fact that there may be a trade-off made in Sacramento, that in lieu of funding for grad initiative or in lieu of facilities or in lieu of compensation, there may be a choice to fund EOP or basic needs or whatever the other item is. So I just want to put that on the table as that's a real reality. Steve talked about that a little bit, but there's only a finite amount of money that the state has on a recurring basis that they can dedicate to us, and they want to dedicate to us because they have a lot of mouths to feed. And so by making unique choices like that, you are making, and it is a risk. I don't think we should call it fear. I think you are risking the fact that you may be not funding those things that you are trying to effectuate significantly over a multi-year period in lieu of something else that may pop up.
Okay. Chair Dune.
Thank you, Chair Kimball. I would first recommend that we bring this to closure, or we're going to run the risk of becoming a Snickers commercial. So I think we all need to get to lunch pretty soon. We've been hard at it for over 5 hours. So I want to advocate on behalf of my colleagues. As to the motion, I respect all the conversation, but I think we as a board run the risk of abdicating our responsibility and our authority if we continue to advocate for line items from the legislature. In other words, what purpose does this board serve if we're simply going to ask for, as noble as the recommendations are, whether it's salaries, which are desperately needed, or basic needs, which are desperately needed, or with all due respect, the Shark Lab at Long Beach, or marine science program at Humboldt State, or any pick your program. I think this board needs to maintain the flexibility in the budgeting process to survey the entire system and every campus and determine amongst this board what are the highest priorities to fund. So with that, Chair Campbell, I yield back.
All right, thank you. And finally, Trustee McGrory.
Are we funding the EOP program now out of the graduation initiative? That 21 million, where's it allocated?
It's going directly to the campuses to support those EOP programs, but on top of that, some campuses are using their allocation of GI 2025 to give further support to the EOP programs. And not only the EOP programs, you heard me mention earlier about proven practices in response to Trustee Adamson's question. And I want to be clear about the fact that there are things that are working very well in EOP that we know is really viable for all students. And those practices include intrusive advising, peer mentoring, supplemental instruction to the development of learning communities. That's what I'm stating that we can be clearer about with our campuses, that it's those practices that are really working strategically for students that are in the EOP program, that's where we would designate the GI 2025 funding to continue to give support to those kinds of proven practices.
I think it's one of those situations, it sounds like, where we have kind of a decentralized policy, and it seems like we ought to have some base level of funding for EOP across the campuses. That's just a recommendation from me, just a suggestion. And secondly, on the existing 15 million for food and room insecurity, we read elsewhere in the agenda that we're going through some kind of an RFP process with the campuses. And it seems like at this point, we ought to be using the money in mid-November that was allocated. I know there's always going to have to be some kind of a bureaucratic process, but it seems like we ought to have a little bit more sense of urgency to get this 15 million deployed.
With those dollars are on their way to the campuses. I should mention as well that it's not just 15 million in one-time funds from last year, that it's actually a total of 24.5 million, 15 million to be used toward basic needs partnerships, what you've just described. The RFP process has ended. The campuses are being notified of the amount of dollars that they'll be receiving. In addition to that, 6.5 million in the rapid rehousing program that ties into student housing needs. Those RFPs have also been reviewed, and those dollars are on their way to the campuses as well. The one area where we are still working through, and campuses have just submitted their proposals to us, is $3 million for mental health partnerships, also one-time funds that were allocated. But I do want to just quickly say that the work that we do around basic needs has a natural home within the graduation initiative under the student engagement and well-being pillar. And so when you heard the figures that were just presented by our chancellor that shows how much money is being spent on recurring and how much in one time, the recurring doesn't surprise me because of the fact that campuses are already using their GI 2025 dollars in order to make sure that they're augmenting support for students in housing security, food security, student mental health, other basic needs such as strengthening partnerships with communities. So I just want to be clear about the fact that while we're talking about 15 million, that number is far more sizable in terms of the support that's being allocated directly by the campuses.
And just in closing.
If you don't mind, I think at this point, in respect for everyone here and Adam's comment too, we need to call, because we should be speaking only to, according to Juan's amendment. So I think before we go any further, we should call, I want to call the question to Juan's amendment. Okay?
So we're going to.
One closing comment. In my campus visits, there is a range of food and insecurity needs being paid attention to in the various campuses. It seems like there ought to be some baseline allocation.
Yes, but we're speaking to Juan's now. So.
All right, so I'm going to call a roll call vote now.
Only committee.
But only committee members may vote. So those members on,
And the
we're on
motion is?
Juan's motion to make the
Juan's motion is to-
$15 million a recurring ask rather than one time. All right. So
Shelkis. Yeah.
Okay, so again, this is only for committee members, and this is on Trustee Garcia's motion to move the one-time $15 million to recurring. Lillian Campbell, Trustee Campbell?
No.
Trustee McGrory?
Yes.
Trustee Adamson?
Yes.
Trustee Carney?
Yes.
Trustee Eisen? Trustee Garcia?
Yes.
Trustee Morales?
Yes.
Trustee Sebelius?
Of course.
Trustee Simon?
Yes.
Trustee Taylor?
Yes.
Okay, the motion carries.
Chair Days, no.
Chair Day, excuse me, sorry.
Chancellor?
No.
The motion still carries.
the motion passes. Motion passes.
That we're going to adjourn and come back to the final item on the Finance Committee after lunch.
The
We'll
investment.
adjourn till.
We still need to vote on the underlying motion. So this is the motion to amend that was just passed, and now there has to be a motion by the committee to approve the underlying motion as amended.
I so move.
Second.
Let's adjourn and have lunch, and we'll come back to that point of order when we come back from lunch.
What time do we come back?
Welcome back to the Board of Trustees meeting. We're in the Committee on Finance. Given the indication from Trustee Sebelius that this item will be pulled tomorrow at plenary, the motion to amend was approved. So now the main motion is before us, which is the staff recommendation as amended by Trustee Garcia. If everyone is clear, that is the motion to approve staff's recommendation with the amendment as approved by Trustee Garcia's amendment. With that, I'd call the question.
Committee members only.
Yeah, you can do voice.
Okay, so all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? All right, the budget.
Quick, respectfully, I oppose.
You're
I'm
opposed.
sorry, I was in a conversation.
Okay, so you,
Didn't got-
one opposed, one abstention, and the operating budget request passes. All right, so item 4 is an information item providing the CSU Annual Investment Report. This item will be presented by Steve Relia, Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer, Robert Eaton, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Finance, Treasury, and Risk Management. Steve, will you please begin?
Yes, thank you, Chair Kimbell. In accordance with board policy, this item provides the annual investment report for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2019. Today's report to the board will also serve as the basis for CSU's annual report on its investments to the State of California Legislature and the Department of Finance as required by state law. I'm pleased to report that the CSU Investment Advisory Committee approved its first distribution of earnings from the total return portfolio. The earnings have been allocated to the campuses, and this distribution is the first of what will be many distributions to help address our sizable capital needs. Here with additional information is Robert Eaton, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Financing, Treasury, and Risk Management. Robert?
Thank you, Executive Vice Chancellor Relier. In the interest of time, I'm going to dispense with my prepared slide presentation and just, we had some information there on the balances of the investment portfolios as of the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2019, as well as their performance. All that information is in your agenda item already. In summary, they are performing well within our return and risk parameters. The main point I do want to emphasize to the board today and report on, as Executive Vice Chancellor Relier just noted, because of the success, the early earning success of the total return portfolio since its inception, at its last meeting, the Investment Advisory Committee approved a distribution of $22.4 million to the campuses. Earlier this month, those funds were distributed to the campuses. Every campus received a share of that, and they are prepared to put that to work on deferred maintenance and capital needs. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and open it up for questions.
Thank you for the presentation, and any questions? Jack?
Just a quick question on the splits here. It seems to me that if the total return portfolio is making 7%, liquidity is making 3%, is there feasibility of moving some of the liquidity portfolio into the total return portfolio? How much actual short-term liquidity do you need to have on the books? I mean, with that kind of spread, $1 billion would get us $40 million.
Right. So two responses to that. The first is that the statutes that allow us to put money into the total return portfolio restrict that to 30% of total investments. We are actually on our way to funding up to that level. Our target is putting $1.2 billion into that by the middle of 2020. So we're kind of putting that in on a step basis to help in terms of the market movements up and down. We don't want to try to time the market. So we will be putting more money into the total return portfolio, and then we will monitor that on an ongoing basis and kind of keep it there around that 30% of total investments. With respect to the balance that's in the liquidity portfolio, one of the things we are working on, consistent with the master investment policy of the Board of Trustees, is what we call an intermediate duration portfolio. It's high-quality fixed income securities, just like the SWIFT portfolio or our liquidity portfolio, but we will put it out for a longer duration and therefore earn a little bit more on that same base of assets. We expect to target that at about $2.1 billion by the middle of 2021. So we're moving a lot of money into some of the higher earning portfolios that we have.
All right. Trustee Taylor?
Yeah, I think bottom line on this, if you remember, members, we've only had an investment committee for about a year and a half. And it was all driven by an objective to say, we can be a little smarter in investing our money. And I think the proof is here to show that with taking modest risk, trust me, I'm a bond guy, as you know, I don't like to take crazy risks. We're able, on average, to produce over $40 million a year in new money, unrestricted money. The only restriction is got to go for deferred maintenance. And, I would love to have the kind of flexibility that UC has, frankly, to invest funds, but we're not quite there yet. I think we're on our way, though, to showing the legislature that we can do this responsibly, thoughtfully, carefully, and really make a solid impact in helping campuses deal with deferred maintenance. So, it's been a pleasure to be chair for the last, now almost 2.5 years, finishing up my third year. And whoever picks up the ball in July, please bring good returns with you.
Okay, seeing no more questions or comments, thank you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, could you tell me who is the investment advisors on these, or is it done internally?
The formal investment advisor that we have is Makita Investment Group.
What is that? I'm sorry.
Makita Investment Group, and they were selected a couple of years ago through a competitive bid process.
Has any thought been given to see if we can consolidate the money allocated for investment with the UC funds selectively as decided in order to, of course, save fees? And on that matter, is this before or after fees, the returns?
It's after fees. To your original question about combining with the UC, very early in the process when we were looking at legislation, we gave that some thought, but there's enough difference in the way we are organized and how we are allowed to invest our funds. That was not a viable option for us in terms of where we wanted to go. But we did explore it.
But it could be.
Well,
what would they have to change?
I would love to see us be able to do that. They'd have to change statute in Sacramento to allow us that flexibility. UC has a great deal more flexibility. They can invest in private equity, venture capital, hedge funds. They can do security selection, individual securities that they think make sense. But they've got now a 70-person investment staff. We have 2 guys sitting right behind you here.
Yeah, that was my point.
And but as the statute is currently written, we can't do that. But maybe one day we'll get the flexibility to
I agree
join
with
in
you,
that process.
but that isn't difficult legislation to have passed, and it benefits everyone. You get the fees reduced because you have critical mass. You have whatever accountability you want, and you have the fees absorbed by the UC fund rather than by the fund itself if you invest in them. At least that's what they do with the UC system, so there's no reason they would have done it any differently, as Steve knows.
Yeah, down the road, to build on Trustee Taylor's earlier point, one of the things we want to do is build a track record with this portfolio so that we can go back to the legislature and take off some of the guardrails if we think it's appropriate at that time. For example, the restriction on the limitations as to how much we could put in the portfolio, the types of investments we could make, and once we are able to broaden that, if we're able to achieve that down the road, then we can give due consideration to partnering with the UC. I mean, we try to partner with the UC on many endeavors, and we would not exclude this as an option down the road.
Thank you. It's great. Those are great returns you got.
Chairman Day, that concludes the business of the Committee on Finance.
Thank you, Chair Campbell. Trustee Eisen, will you please convene the Committee on Campus Planning, Buildings and Grounds?
Thank you, Chair Day. We will go quickly to try to make up some time. Will the Committee on Campus Planning, I'm not going to even say Buildings and Grounds, please come to order. There are no requests for public comments, so we'll go straight to the consent agenda. It's now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Any objections to the approval of the consent agenda? Hearing none, the consent agenda is approved. We have 2 items on today's discussion agenda. One is an action item, one's an information item. The action item requests approval of the